There's a particular kind of guru who never has to raise his voice, never has to threaten anyone with fire or judgment, never even has to build a wall, because he's already convinced you that whatever you believe, you arrived at it yourself. Osho was that kind of guru. Ask any of his old followers whether they were told what to think, and most of them will tell you, quite sincerely, that nobody ever told them anything. That was the entire design. He never once demanded belief. He told people to doubt everything, including him, and somehow that single instruction became one of the most effective leashes ever built, because a leash you tie around your own neck never feels like one. He said it plainly, over and over, in that calm, amused voice he used for his biggest claims. Don't follow me, don't believe me, just look for yourself. On paper, that sounds like the opposite of religion. No commandments handed down from a mountain, no catechism to memorize before you're allowed an opinion, no holy text you're forbidden to question. And yet somewhere between look for yourself and several thousand people changing their names, their clothing, and eventually their citizenship to sit at his feet, something happened that resembled with uncomfortable precision the very thing he claimed to be dismantling. The vocabulary changed. The architecture underneath it stayed remarkably intact. Here's the detail worth sitting with if you enjoy watching how a mind gets rearranged, rather than just noting what it ends up believing. Telling someone not to believe you isn't humility. It's a more sophisticated form of persuasion, because it disarms the one defense a skeptical person is actually trained to use, resistance to being told what to think, and replaces it with something almost impossible to argue with, which is the feeling of having thought it up yourself. Nobody debates their own conclusions with much enthusiasm. People will defend for decades an idea they believe they reached independently in a way they rarely defend an order barked at them by a stranger in robes. Whether by instinct or design, Osho understood that the deepest obedience is never commanded. It's grown privately inside a mind that's just been told it's free. Consider what it actually cost to become one of his followers, because the cost is where the real machinery lives. You gave up the name your parents chose, the one on your birth certificate, the one your childhood friends still used, and you accepted a new one, usually borrowed from Sanskrit, handed to you personally, like a small christening. You put on orange, and later a deep maroon, not for an afternoon, but for years, in whatever ordinary country you eventually went home to, where it marked you instantly as someone who had left the tribe you were born into to a stranger one. You wore his photograph on a string of wooden beads against your chest and touched it, probably, far more often than you'd have admitted to a skeptical old friend. None of this was forced on anyone. Every part of it was chosen, freely, in daylight, which is exactly why it worked so well. The mind has an old, dependable trick for handling an expensive choice. Once the price has been paid, it stops asking whether the purchase was worth it and starts finding reasons it obviously was, because admitting the mistake would now cost more than simply staying convinced. Nobody enjoys discovering that they traded their name, their family dinners, and a decade of income for nothing. So the mind, without waiting for permission, quietly does the convincing on your behalf. There was also a technique for getting past the part of a person that argues back. Osho built an entire meditation around it. Chaotic breathing worked into a kind of controlled hyperventilation, followed by catharsis, shouting, jumping, until the body had burned through whatever it was holding on to, and only then, in the exhausted stillness that followed, came the silence and the supposed insight. It's worth noticing this is not a new invention dressed up in Eastern robes. Revival tents have run the same circuit for a very long time. Raise the emotional temperature until the analytical mind gets tired and steps aside, then walk the conviction in through the back door while it's unguarded. Speaking in tongues, weeping at the altar, fainting in the aisle, different vocabulary, same basic engineering. Wear a mind out first, convince it later. It's remarkable how rarely anyone questions a revelation that arrives the moment they're too exhausted to interrogate it.
Part of what made this particular guru so effective was that he was selling to two disappointed audiences at once, and most people only ever noticed the one they belonged to. There were the disillusioned religious, raised on guilt and inherited doctrine, who wanted out from under all of that, but weren't ready to feel like they'd lost their way entirely. And then there were the disillusioned seekers of the counterculture, who'd already rejected inherited religion and gone looking for meaning in poverty and renunciation, only to discover that giving things up doesn't automatically make a person feel found. Osho told the first group there was no doctrine at all, only awareness. He told the second group that poverty wasn't holiness, that pleasure wasn't sin, that a person could be enlightened and still enjoy silk, sex, and a decent car. Both groups heard exactly the message they were already hoping to hear, delivered by a man who seemed to have invented it just for them. That isn't a spiritual breakthrough, that's extremely good listening, followed by extremely good positioning.
Every system like this needs two products, not one. And the real skill is selling both from the same counter. First, it has to convince you that something is deeply wrong with you as you currently are. Unconscious, asleep, conditioned, sinful, whichever word the century prefers. Then, it has to be the only place selling the cure. Osho's version of the ailment was almost elegant in its simplicity. You don't actually know who you are, and every ordinary comfort you rely on, your name, your family, your certainty, is the disease pretending to be its own remedy. Once a person accepts that diagnosis, the price of treatment climbs on its own. Robes are cheap. Rewriting your entire identity is not. By the early 1980s, this philosophy of self-generated devotion had outgrown a garden in Pune and needed an entire country to stretch out in. Several thousand followers bought 65,000 acres of high desert ranch land in Oregon, laid roads, built an airport and a reservoir, and incorporated their own city under his name. The small neighboring town of Antelope, population somewhere in the double digits, was quietly absorbed, its council seats, and eventually its very name, taken over by people who had spent years insisting they'd transcended the need for politics, and who then, within a couple of seasons, ran one of the more ruthless local political operations Oregon has ever recorded. Thousands of homeless men and women were bussed in from across the country, offered a warm meal and a bed, and handed voter registration cards, all in hope of tipping a county election in the commune's favor. When the local election board balked and started rejecting the paperwork, the commune's leadership found a different, far less arguable way to solve their turnout problem. If the people of a nearby town couldn't be persuaded to stay home on election day, they could be made too sick to leave the house. In the autumn of 1984, followers walked into 10 restaurants in the town of the Dalles and seasoned the salad bars with a culture of salmonella grown in the commune's own medical laboratory. 751 people got sick, 45 were hospitalized. It remains, to this day, the largest bioterror attack on American soil, and it wasn't carried out by some foreign enemy or a lone radical acting alone in a basement. It was carried out by nurses, secretaries, and cooks, people who had spent years being taught that the self they used to be was an illusion worth discarding, who apparently discarded, somewhere along the way, the part of a person that flinches at poisoning a stranger's lunch. Nobody handed them a direct order from a pulpit that day. As far as most of them understood it, they were protecting something they had personally chosen, something they had rebuilt their entire identity around. That detail should worry you more than it comforts you. An order from the outside can be resisted, questioned, refused. A conviction grown from the inside just gets quietly carried out. The woman who organized it, a former secretary who had risen to become the commune's chief administrator and its face to the world's press, would later explain that her only aim the whole time was to protect her guru. She said this on her way into a courtroom, in handcuffs, apparently still smiling.
Within days of the plot coming apart, the same man who had spent a decade insisting there was nothing to obey and no one to worship stood in front of television cameras and denounced her as dangerous, dishonest, and no longer welcome anywhere near the movement he'd built entirely on the premise that nobody owed him a thing. Her robes were burned in a bonfire, along with several thousand copies of a book she had apparently ghostwritten and published under his name. She pleaded guilty to attempted murder, arson, and wiretapping her own community, a charge sheet that included arranging poison for Osho's own personal physician, who survived only because the attempt went wrong. She served just under 2.5 years, was deported, and eventually settled in Switzerland, married a local citizen, and became, of all things, the manager of 2 nursing homes outside Basel, where for the past several decades she has spent her days caring for elderly patients with dementia. A woman once convicted of orchestrating the largest bioterror attack in American history now spends her afternoons reminding strangers to take their medication on schedule. If you're hunting for evidence that the universe has a sense of humor, you could do worse than start there.
Osho himself was arrested weeks later in North Carolina, moved through a string of jails over roughly 12 days without bail, and by his own account, made to register under a false name so reporters couldn't easily track him down. He avoided a trial by pleading guilty enough to arranging sham marriages so his followers could stay in the country illegally, accepted a substantial fine in a suspended sentence, and left the United States for what amounted to a world tour of countries that didn't want him. Something like 20 of them turned him away in succession before India eventually took him back. And then, of course, there were the cars. At the height of Rajneeshpuram, his personal fleet of Rolls-Royces numbered 93, not a rumor, an actual inventory, maintained by dedicated staff, serviced on-site by engineers the manufacturer flew in themselves, because even a luxury car company recognizes a good customer when it sees one. Followers lined the commune's main road each morning to watch him glide past in a different one, throwing flowers at the hood as though the machine itself might appreciate the gesture. When it was pointed out, reasonably, that a man famous for preaching detachment from material things had assembled a small nation's worth of ultra-luxury automobiles, his answer amounted to a fairly elegant piece of theology. The cars, he said, weren't really about him at all. They were a mirror. People who considered themselves spiritual were consumed with jealousy over 93 cars they'd never even seen in person, and that reaction told you far more about their own attachments than his. He mentioned more than once that a comfortable seat was simply a better place to meditate than the back of a bullock cart, which is either the most honest thing a mystic has ever said about comfort or the first. One clergyman, by his own later account, spent every Sunday publicly condemning the guru as a vulgar materialist, then wrote privately asking whether the commune might spare just one Rolls-Royce for the church. He never denied the accusation of hypocrisy. He simply let the hypocrisy make his argument for him. That move is worth studying closely because it's the same trick every scandal-surviving belief system eventually discovers on its own. A contradiction turns up, a preacher with 3 mansions, a monk with a Swiss bank account, a guru with 93 Rolls-Royces, and instead of the contradiction breaking the belief simply grows a new limb to absorb it. The wealth stops being evidence of hypocrisy and becomes evidence of a wisdom too advanced for ordinary moral arithmetic. The critic isn't spotting a flaw anymore, he's revealing his own poverty of spirit by even bothering to look. None of this is a new trick with new packaging. When the medieval church began selling forgiveness in exchange for money, a fairly direct transaction that promised a shorter stay in purgatory for a fixed price, the outrage it produced wasn't a flaw in the plan, it was practically the plan, and it took a genuinely stubborn German monk nailing a list of grievances to a door to put even a dent in it. Complaints about the wealth of religious institutions are, historically, one of the oldest and least effective genres of criticism there is, because the wealth was never really the argument's weak point. The weak point was always what people were willing to overlook in order to keep believing. And across every century anyone has bothered to check, the answer is a great deal.
Underneath both of those examples sits a piece of logic worth naming plainly because it explains almost everything else. A belief system that can absorb any possible contradiction and turn it into further proof of itself isn't actually making claims about the world anymore. It's just describing itself endlessly in different costumes. If the guru is wealthy, that proves his wisdom. If he'd lived simply, that would have proven it too. If the prophecy comes true, faith is rewarded. If it doesn't, faith is being tested. There is, structurally, no outcome left over that could count as evidence against the thing, which sounds like strength from the inside and looks, from anywhere else, exactly like the opposite.
There's an old case study, nothing to do with Osho at all, that shows how deep this particular pattern runs. In the 1950s, a small American group became convinced with complete sincerity that the world would end on a specific date and that only they would be lifted to safety by a visiting spacecraft. Members quit jobs, sold houses, and said goodbye to relatives who wouldn't listen. Midnight arrived. Nothing happened. You would think that's the exact moment belief collapses under the plain weight of being wrong. Instead, most of the group became more convinced, not less, deciding their faith alone had persuaded their unseen visitors to spare the planet after all, and they went out recruiting with more energy than before. A century earlier, a different American preacher convinced tens of thousands that a similar ending would arrive on a specific day in 1844. When the date passed without incident, the event became known, with a bluntness rare in religious history, as the Great Disappointment. And yet the movement didn't dissolve. It reorganized, reinterpreted the date as something spiritual rather than literal, and grew into one of the larger religious denominations practiced today. Failure, it turns out, is rarely fatal to belief. Usually it's just fuel, provided the believers have already paid enough that walking away would feel like the bigger loss. What Osho understood, better than most men who ever built a movement around themselves, is that very few people actually want the freedom they claim to be chasing. Total freedom is exhausting. It means waking up every morning and deciding from nothing what your life is for, with no one to blame if you get it wrong and no one to thank if you get it right. What most people want most of the time is relief from exactly that decision, offered in language convincing enough that accepting it doesn't feel like giving up. Hand someone a rule book and they'll feel its weight immediately. Tell them there is no rule book, that they are at last gloriously free, and then quietly become the only voice they trust to interpret what that freedom is supposed to mean, and you'll end up with more control over them than the strictest priest ever managed through threats, because they'll never feel the leash tighten. They tied the knot themselves. They can feel it if they reach for it. They just call it something else. Even his death didn't escape the pattern. In January of 1990, at 58, he died at his ashram in Pune under circumstances his own inner circle has never fully agreed on. His personal physician insisted for years afterward that American authorities had poisoned him with a heavy metal during a brief incarceration half a decade earlier, a theory built on symptoms, suspicion, and an understandable reluctance to accept that 2 decades of self-administered nitrous oxide might explain a slow physical decline just as well as a government conspiracy would. Osho himself, from his own sickbed, blamed the Reagan administration directly, by name. Whichever version sounds more believable to you says less about the evidence, which is thin either way, and more about which story a person needed to be true. A martyr's death protects a legacy. An ordinary one, brought on partly by a man's own habits, does not. His followers were never really offered the second option because by then there was no one left in the room whose entire sense of self wasn't already built on his infallibility. Nobody survives that long inside a belief system by being the one who raises a hand and asks the obvious question. None of this really needed a locked gate or an armed guard standing between a person and the door, though for a while Rajneeshpuram had both. The actual device was quieter than that and far more durable. Convince someone that the walls were their own idea, that the robe was their own choice, that the surrender was in fact the bravest kind of freedom anyone had ever handed them, and you no longer need to guard the exit at all. They'll guard it for you, cheerfully, against anyone who tries to walk back through it, including an older, wiser version of themselves, years down the line, quietly wondering what happened to their 20s. That's the particular genius and the particular cruelty hiding inside the sentence still used about him today, usually meant as a compliment. He never told anyone what to believe. He didn't have to.
He built the conditions, handed over the tools, and stepped back far enough to watch several thousand people do the rest of the work themselves, cheerfully, for decades, calling it liberation the entire time. Nobody brainwashed them. They just never noticed themselves doing it, which, if you sit with it for more than a moment, was always the more impressive trick.